His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. We're going back in time, way back to the age of exploration and the golden age of the Netherlands. It's kind of a story of what might have been, or a look back at the road not taken. Talking mostly about language, mostly about the Hudson Valley, but we'll get into early Brooklyn, make some connections with Nassau and Suffolk. We're going Dutch today with today's very special guest.
Yeah, I'm Kieran O'Keefe. I am an assistant professor of history at Lyon College, which is a small college in rural Arkansas, but I am originally from New York State, and I got my PhD at George Washington University in 2021. My background is really in the Revolutionary era and looking at loyalists in particular in the American Revolution. But having grown up in New York, I always had an interest in the Dutch history of the state, going back to the founding of New Netherland and the long legacy that left in the region, which is how I came to this interest in the Dutch language in New York.
And I'll start by saying goedenavond, which is about all the Dutch I can muster tonight, but thank you for joining us.
Goedenavond. Yeah.
We're on Libsyn Connect tonight. I guess first quick question, do you speak Dutch, or how much of the language do you know?
Only a little bit. Ik spreek alleen een beetje Nederlands. I don't know a ton of it. I can probably read it better than I can speak it. But I know more than, I know something, but I would not say I know the language, is how I put it.
Great. So just to set the stage a little, we're here to talk about an article you published in the New York History Journal. When did New York stop speaking Dutch? The persistence of the Dutch language in Old New Netherland. And that came out in...
Oh, that was very recent. That was just in the last few months. I couldn't give you an exact date, but maybe September. Yeah, within the last couple of months.
So we're catching you right off of this, which is great. Why was that an interesting historical question to you?
I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and there are a lot of Dutch place names in the region. Fish kill, cats, anything with kill in it, because kill is the 17th century Dutch word for creek, though it's not in modern Dutch. So there are all these, all these Dutch place names that was, just something I was exposed to growing up. And when you drive into New England, if you drive from New York to Connecticut, like the place names change a lot. So all these English names suddenly in a way that in New York is more diverse in its place name. So I think there's like the personal interest in that sense. But it was just kind of fascinating to me too, to see how people can, how they handle their language over the course of a long period of time. So I think generally what happens with immigrant communities is that you have the parents come over, let's say they come from Italy, they speak Italian, maybe pick up a little bit of English in the United States. They're not really going to know English. They're going to be probably monolingual Italian for the most part. The children will be bilingual, and then the grandchildren will probably be monolingual English and maybe not know any Italian at all. And when you study like New Netherland, you could do this in Louisiana too. It's a different story in that because these were established colonies, when you're talking about Louisiana or New Netherland, they're not immigrants. And so it's the assimilation process is going to be a lot slower than if you're talking about like an immigrant community coming from Europe and then sort of assimilating into an already established society, if that makes sense. And so it was just interesting to see how the development played over the course of time.
And we're not going to spoil by answering the question yet, when did it stop? But as I was looking into it, in just maybe the idea of introducing people or reintroducing people to Old New Netherland, because the Dutch colonial exercise on the east coast of America is somewhat unique, or I'll let you describe it. But can you maybe just give us the groundwork of what the Dutch were doing on the east coast in the early 1600s?
Yeah, 17th century. Yeah, so the Dutch, the Netherlands is actually a pretty newly independent country by the early 1600s. It had gained its independence from Spain and actually was still fighting Spain while it was establishing New Netherland for its independence. And so it's a new country, but it takes a pretty much immediate interest in the age of exploration and colonial expansion. And although I think the greatest Dutch presence in its colonies is going to be in Southeast Asia and what's now Indonesia, it does take an interest in the Western Hemisphere as well. And initially, the initial Dutch interest comes from Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson is actually an Englishman, as you can tell by the name, but he sails for the Dutch East India Company, which is a joint stock company that's really like a private corporation operating for the, let's say, the economic interests of and political interests of the Dutch state in terms of colonization. And he is initially supposed to go actually try to find a passage to Asia across the North Pole, but ends up making his way to North America, comes up the Hudson River, which obviously bears his name. And that gives the Dutch like this early claim to the region. But it's not really until the 1620s the Dutch put down permanent roots. And so in 1624, the Dutch established Fort Orange, which is where Albany is today, so near where the Hudson and Mohawk rivers meet. And that will be a huge fur trading outpost. And so the early years, the Dutch presence are much of it is centered around the fur trade, particularly the relationship with the Mohawk people of the Iroquois Confederacy. So there's Fort Orange. Shortly after that, the Dutch famously buy Manhattan Island from the local indigenous peoples and establish New Amsterdam. And the Dutch colony is like a presence, the presence of Dutch people in the colony is going to last about 40 years. So 1624 is Fort Orange. 1664 is when the English show up and take over the colony. The colony, although it begins more fur trade focused, it is going to develop more of like an agricultural element to it over time. There's wheat, there's even tobacco grown there. So it starts out more fur trade, but has a more diverse economy by the time it's taken over by the English. And so the English take it over in 1664. Much less known is that the Dutch came back and took it over very briefly for about a year and a half in 1673 and 1674. And then they actually renamed it New Orange for that brief period. They had it back. Then with the peace treaty ending the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1674, they returned it to England permanently once and for all.
And so just a few curious things. They were curious to me. So geographically speaking, we know or we learned the history of the Dutch in Manhattan, but it was a lot of the colony was settlements up the Hudson River, which you knew because you grew up there, but also into New Jersey and into Maryland, and I'm not sure how far south, but it was not just a New York centric colony.
Yeah, it's primarily in New York, but not exclusively, right? So the Dutch do have New Amsterdam is really like New Amsterdam and Fort Orange, really the center of the colony, but there is a presence along the Delaware River as well. So the Swedish actually established a colony there in the 1630s, and then 1655 the Dutch went down to the Delaware River and captured that from the Swedes. And so there was a small Dutch presence along the Delaware River in what's now Delaware and southern New Jersey. Like Nassau County, roughly the border between what's now Nassau and Suffolk is sort of the eastern edge of New Netherland. They do have a presence along the Connecticut River, although that's pretty limited, and that will be claimed and really controlled by Connecticut more so than the Dutch. So the Dutch do have a settlement briefly at what is now Hartford, Connecticut. But the vast majority of the New Netherland population is somewhere within relative close proximity to the Hudson River.
Okay, great. And I'll pull you out to Long Island to the extent I can, but we're probably going to be up the Hudson more than across the East River. But in terms of the way the Dutch looked at settling, they did not have a Mayflower that came over with huge groups of families. Or how would you characterize the approach they took to getting the Dutch people over here?
Yeah, there's no Dutch Great Migration. There's a Great Migration that brings all these Puritan settlers to Massachusetts. There's no equivalent to that in New Netherlands. The Dutch colony is pretty small, much smaller than the English colonies, and there's kind of been debates among historians why that was. Part of it probably is that the quality of life in the Netherlands is just very high. This is an era known as the Dutch Golden Age, the 17th century. There's relative wealth in the Netherlands, and if you're doing really well in the Netherlands, why are you gonna move to America? That's part of it. And then also the Dutch are focused on the fur trade, which is not really like a settlement oriented type of colony. And it's actually much of the growth of New Netherland comes within the last few years of the existence of the colony, because that's when the economy becomes a little more diverse and you have more farming and other kind of economic endeavors that do require settlement. And another reason, too, historians have pointed to is that especially in the lower Hudson Valley, there is a lot of conflict with local American Indian peoples. And if you're living in The Hague or something, and then the Netherlands, and what you know about New Netherland is that there's this bloody Indian war taking place, it's not going to make it a very attractive place to settle.
And just to put a circle around the Dutch era, so you mentioned and we know the story of the British come in and take over. This is a big question for a historian. Maybe you tell me if it's naive to ask it this way, but why did the Dutch lose control of it, or could they have fought harder for it? You say they retook it. So did they negotiate it away? Did they just not want it as badly, or why did they lose control of it, would you say?
There are a few different reasons. I think like a short answer would be that they swap it for colonies that now make up the country of Suriname, which is going to be a Dutch colony until the 1970s. And so there's like plantation wealth there that doesn't exist in the Netherlands. I would also say that just nothing's inevitable in history, but just the location of New Netherland, it's a little hard to see how it would have persisted as a Dutch colony, just because it's sandwiched in between the English colonies in New England and the English colonies in Virginia and Maryland to the south. And those colonies just have so many more colonists than New Netherland does. And, the Dutch occupy the Hudson River, which is, I would say, along with the St. Lawrence River, the most important waterway into the continent on the east coast of North America. And so it's a really, really attractive location. It's much easier to get the Great Lakes from the Hudson River than it is from pretty much any other river on the east coast of North America outside the St. Lawrence. And so the English are really desirous of it for that reason as well. So it's not a great situation geographically for the Dutch to maintain control of, I would say. And then they just don't have the colonists. The estimates for Netherlands vary a bit, but maybe it had 9,000 colonists by the time the English take over in 1664. I couldn't give you the exact number of the population of New England, but I'm sure it's many, many times that.
And they don't kick the Dutch out, right? Basically, the people that are living in New Amsterdam still live there. It's just New York now, and they get assimilated. Well, I don't know if assimilated is the right word, but what was the English approach to the existing Dutch population?
Initially, their approach, I'd say, is pretty conciliatory. They recognize that they are a minority in this new colony. I mean, New Netherland is very diverse in of itself. Like the Dutch population in New Netherland is probably only a little over half the population. There are a lot of Germans, there are some French Huguenots, there are some English colonists in New Netherland, some Scandinavians. It's a very diverse colony, but the English recognize that they're a minority in what's now New York, which had been New Netherland. If they came in guns blazing and began persecuting the Dutch population, that's not going to go a long way to maintaining effective control of the new colony. And so overall, they're pretty conciliatory. They are going to allow the Dutch to keep their property. They're going to respect the existence of the Dutch Reformed Church. They're not going to seize land from anybody. They're not going to punish people for having supported the Dutch in earlier wars. So overall, they're pretty conciliatory. And I think what I'd like to win over the Dutch population as much as they can to establish effective control over the colony.
And so to get to the crux of your research, were the English looking to impose their language from the start?
In official capacity, I would say yes, in the sense of like the language of the courts, the language of government. So in those official institutions, yes. But in terms of like everyday life, there's no effort at a really early date, at least, to try to force the Dutch population to learn English. And that's going to happen gradually. And later on, England will take some actions to try to promote the use of the English language. So, for example, there's a English governor in the early 18th century. He's talking about like a generation after it's been taken over by the English. But there's an English governor in the early 18th century who limits the number of Dutch schoolmasters in New York City, which I think you could reasonably interpret as a way of limiting access to education in the Dutch language, obviously, which is going to push people to English. There are efforts to try to convert some of the Dutch subjects in New York from the Dutch Reformed Church to the Church of England, which is going to operate in English, not in Dutch, of course. And so there are some actions you can say they take, but most of those are a bit later. Very early on, most of the, I would say, Anglicization is really in the official government level more than anything else.
let's just briefly get to what we can about Long Island. So in this period, and you can correct me for anything I'm misstating, but the extent of the Dutch settlement on Long Island was mostly in the western part, right? Brooklyn was heavily Dutch influenced. The word Brooklyn is from Dutch origin, and into Queens, Flushing was Vlissingen, and so the mythical border of Nassau and Queens I've heard, is sort of the extent, or the Dutch control wanes as you go east of that. Anything that you would say just to what you learned about Dutch presence on Long Island as you started to research?
Yeah, it depends where you are on Long Island. Like Suffolk County, there's really not much of a Dutch presence. That's more or less part of the Connecticut colony up until 1664. If you're on the further west part of Long Island, though, there is more of a Dutch presence. So some of the churches, for example, in Brooklyn, some of the Dutch Reformed churches there, they keep operating in Dutch for a long time. And part of what I wanted to do in this research is like try to figure out like how long Dutch was used on headstones in Dutch Reformed church cemeteries. And the last Dutch Reformed churches that have Dutch language headstones in them are actually both in Brooklyn, in Flatbush and Flatlands. Those two churches had Dutch language headstones until I think 1817 were the last ones there, and those are the latest ones I've ever found. So there are certain pockets where Dutch lasted a long time in the western part of Long Island, probably more so in Brooklyn than in Queens, I would say, but there are some references I've found to, for example, like African Americans who were speaking Dutch in Queens County, which then included Nassau County up until like the 1880s. So it certainly lasts a long time in the western part of Long Island.
Let's bring that in. One of the things that I had never thought of, but the fact that the Dutch were the major holders of enslaved people, and they were teaching them Dutch. So you saw persistence of the Dutch language in enslaved and then free blacks.
Yeah, so the Black community in New York and New Jersey, they hold on to Dutch longer than almost any other group. And I think if you look at the roots of that, the Dutch colony, New Netherland, did bring in a fair number of enslaved Africans at a pretty early date. They didn't have all that many indentured servants in New Netherland if you compare it to, let's say, like Virginia. And so they're using African slavery at a relatively early date. And if you fast forward to, say, like the late 18th century, if you have a community where the population is more Dutch than another community, that community is going to have more slaves than the less Dutch community. Like slaveholding in New York is much higher in Dutch communities than the communities that are less Dutch. And I think some of that goes back to the early roots of New Netherland and slavery. So many of the enslaved Africans, they learn Dutch because that's the environment they're in. And they hold on to the language longer and for reasons of, I would say, discrimination. They don't have easy access to education, for example, which is going to open the door to the English language. They're going to be more excluded from public life. We're getting to know English, and where English can be more useful. We're going to be more exposed to English and be more isolated to the private life due to reasons of prejudice and discrimination. And for those reasons, the African American community holds on to Dutch for a long time. The most famous example of that is Sojourner Truth, who actually only knows how to speak Dutch for the first few years of her life. So up until, I think, age 9, she only knew Dutch, and then she's eventually sold to somebody else who doesn't speak Dutch, and that actually caused a lot of issues for her in terms of like the language barrier. And she will, of course, learn how to speak English, but that's somebody, she's born in, I think, the 1790s, and so even at that date, you have somebody who's Black and enslaved, and they only know Dutch for the early years of their life, which gives you an idea of how ingrained it was in the Black community in Hudson Valley and other parts of New York.
Yeah, and talking about the late 1700s or going into the Revolutionary time, you mentioned that they were translating documents into Dutch to win over the population. So I don't know if it was the Declaration of Independence, but the colonists that were rebelling, they were conscious of we've got to translate some of this into Dutch so they get the message. Yeah,
so they make use of Dutch in a variety of different ways. So there are they translate like the minutes of the Continental Congress into Dutch. There are cases of like something like the government body in New York during the Revolution when they're taking depositions. They take them in Dutch and translate them into English. So, for example, it's common if you look at like government records in the Revolutionary War in New York to find people reporting about others who they thought were loyalists. And so you'll find cases where where somebody will go give a deposition to local authorities and say, my neighbor, I think he's a loyalist, and that deposition is given in Dutch and then has to be translated into English. And going on the other direction, there are loyalist agents who are active on the manor of Livingston, which is in what's now southern Columbia County. And many of the tenants were Dutch and either didn't know much or any English. And so they actually end up enlisting the support of a very young man who is bilingual, because he can communicate with both the English tenants, but also the Dutch tenants. And so they can better coordinate like an insurrection against the revolution if they have somebody who's bilingual and can tap into both the Dutch and English communities.
And what I want to ask you about is you bring in evidence from contemporary sources, so diaries and letters. And I was very pleased to see one of my favorite 18th century travel writings, the Itinerarium of Dr. Alexander Hamilton you mentioned.
Yeah.
So do you want to say what surprises or what evidence you gleaned from other people's mentions of the Dutch they were hearing spoken, or where they found Dutch being spoken?
Yeah, so I'd say geographically, if you look at like travelers' accounts, they often talk about the Dutch language being spoken. Sometimes they're surprised by how many people still speak it. It's particularly true if you go up the Hudson River, like Ulster County, parts of Dutchess County, Columbia, Greene, Albany counties all have a lot of Dutch speakers. What becomes Rockland County does as well. Yeah, and sometimes they're surprised at the Dutch language. Overall, I would say there's a little bit of a sense of disdain for it as well. So Dutch kind of takes on this perception of being like a backwards language, a language with a lower sort, not a sign of gentility. And there's one account I have in there of a guy named Alexander Coventry who lives near Albany, in the Albany area, and he ends up meeting an attractive Dutch-speaking woman, and she speaks in Dutch, and he's like, "That's the only time in my life I thought Dutch sounded good," something to that effect. So that's kind of gives you an idea of how a lot of non-Dutch speakers view the language, and even like for those Dutch New Yorkers who do speak Dutch, they actually try hard to like eliminate the Dutch accent from their English because they're concerned that it will make them sound uneducated and backwards, and that's obviously not how they want to sound. So in that article, I have a letter that a guy named Peter Van Schack wrote to his son where he says, like, you need to get rid of the Dutch accent and the way you pronounce this and the way you pronounce that. And I think the implication is you don't want to sound like you're uneducated and backwards. So eliminate the Dutch accent and just sound like you're English.
It's interesting, and this is not the thrust of your research, but when you think about like the term Knickerbocker is a Dutch phrase, I believe, and Washington Irving with Sleepy Hollow and the Dutch legend. So, and even Santa Claus. So the remnants of the Dutch culture sort of were embraced, but not the language. Would you say, or what do you see as a distinction maybe between those two legacies?
Yeah. So like the Sinterklaas part it's a little bit. I think the origins are a little bit contested. But I think really what happened with Sinterklaas is that there's no evidence it was ever celebrated in New Netherland. There's no evidence of that. It actually was like adopted, if I remember the research correctly, at a later date by colonists in New York as like a throwback to the Dutch origins without having actually ever been celebrated by the Dutch colonists there. So it's almost like an invented memory, if that makes sense. But yeah, there's I don't know, like Washington Irving in the 19th century, right? He's very interested in the early Dutch history. And a lot of his famous short stories are based on that, obviously. So the legend of Sleepy Hollow takes place in the Dutch community, Ichabod Crane, or the Dutch Reformed Church opposite Sleepy Hollow. And then there's Rip Van Winkle, obviously a very, very Dutch name. And he goes up into the mountain and comes back after the revolutions happen. So there's an interest in like the Dutch history. But yeah, the language itself is something that's seen as backwards and antiquated.
Yeah, and just to flash forward, so just my last Long Island reference is Walt Whitman's grandparents spoke Dutch. I think Theodore Roosevelt's grandparents. So it's already generations removed once we get to these people, and they were either not taught the language or by then it was not very prevalent. Although I believe you correct me, but Martin Van Buren, future president, could he speak Dutch? He's from a Dutch family, so.
Yeah, so that's kind of a complicated question, actually. So okay. If you're doing like trivia or something. It's kind of a fun trivia question. Who's the only president to not speak English as their first language? And the answer is usually they give is Martin Van Buren. And that answer, I wouldn't say it's wrong, but it is kind of incomplete. So Van Buren, I think, almost certainly spoke Dutch. But the evidence for it is actually really limited. It just comes down to a few different things. So one, he's born in Kinderhook in 1782, and it's a very Dutch community. But he's definitely exposed to English as a child because his parents run a tavern and who was going to have both English and Dutch clientele. So his father was probably bilingual. Van Buren was sent to did attend a school in the town run by the Dutch Reformed Church, which operated in Dutch. And so he's attending a Dutch language school when he's young. But he never wrote anything in Dutch. He never said he spoke Dutch. There are a few anecdotal accounts that after the presidency, when he was back in Kinderhook in retirement, like in the 1850s, that he would speak Dutch to some of the old Dutch farmers in the community. But it's something he probably spoke like with his wife very privately. But he used English a lot more than he ever used Dutch.
So if we were to put you on the spot to answer your own question, when did New York stop speaking Dutch?
So it's a gradual process, but the last remnants of Dutch speakers in what had been New Netherland last into the 20th century. So in the two areas where it tends to last the longest are sort of outside Albany and along the Mohawk River, the lower Mohawk River, and then in northern New Jersey and in Bergen County. And in those places, there are Dutch speakers until at least the 1930s or so. The last person who spoke Jersey Dutch, the Jersey Dutch variation of Dutch, last fluent speaker of that died in 1949. Then his brother, who spoke Dutch to some degree, died in 1962. But it certainly is spoken well into the 20th century by at least a small part of the population. But at that point, it's a tiny number of people. But it's around for a long time. And I actually remember learning that when I was younger, that there were some people who spoke Dutch into the 20th century. I thought that was really fascinating because it's hundreds of years removed from New Netherland.
So in the mountainous regions, and I don't want to make it sound like another Appalachia, but so there were settlements of Dutch that the geography kind of lent itself to preserving that kind of language speaking.
Yeah, the geography plays a role in it. So Bergen County, New Jersey is pretty mountainous. Bergen is literally the Dutch word for mountains. So it is mountainous. And then, if you go further up the Hudson River, the Helderberg is a mountainous region outside of Albany where there are a lot of Dutch speakers into the 20th century. So it gives them some isolation. So there's geographic isolation that helps it persist there. I think there are other reasons too why Dutch lasts a long time. Part of it is its connection to the Dutch Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church, many of those congregations hold on to Dutch as the language of service into the 19th century, which gives it a basic support, gives you some utility for knowing Dutch, some reason to know Dutch, some reason to speak Dutch, which I think incentivizes people to maintain the language into generations longer than you would anticipate. But certainly the geography plays a big role in it too.
And so this is somewhat of a bigger question, but in terms of the Dutch history of New York and the history of New Netherland and the research of it, my limited understanding, but there was a lot of primary sources in Dutch that maybe were not getting the attention until the New Netherland project. Do you see a renewed interest, say in the last decades or however long, in diving deeper into the Dutch roots of New York? And that would, I guess, perforce me knowing how to speak and read Dutch.
I think there's been more interest in recent years. 2009 was actually there's a big surge of interest around that time because that was the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson arriving in the Hudson River. This year is the 400th anniversary of Fort Orange. We've got the anniversary of New Amsterdam coming up, which will help generate some interest in it as well. But certainly the New Netherland project has played a big role in it because it's not even a matter of just knowing Dutch. It's a matter of knowing 17th century Dutch and being able to read the handwriting. So you could know modern Dutch perfectly. That doesn't mean you'd be able to read anything. You probably couldn't read anything that was written in the 17th century. I certainly can't read it. And having those translated is huge. And it does open up a whole nother part of America's colonial history if you can use those sources and put together that part of the American story.
Yeah, and just as we touched on earlier, it opens up the whole Dutch history, the fact that it was a newer country at the time, and then their expansion, colonialism into other parts of the globe. It veers off from the English narrative of the colonies, into other directions that I think a lot of people don't don't follow. Once the Dutch leave New York, they kind of, we don't know what the rest of their story is, or at least I didn't.
Yeah, 13 colonies are extremely diverse, and the Dutch in New York are part of that story, New York and New Jersey. You have a large presence of people here who speak Dutch beyond the American Revolution into the history of the early United States. It gives you a sense of the real diversity of early America, real ethnic diversity of early America. The middle colonies as a whole are just incredibly diverse. Obviously, there's the Dutch, there's the Swedish, there are Finnish settlers, there are English settlers, German, Scots-Irish. But the Dutch are a big part of that story, and something that, I mean, historians know it, but the general public, especially if you're not from New York, probably doesn't have as much an appreciation of.
A big dankjewel to Kieran O'Keefe for speaking with us today. It's an interesting thought that if history had broken a different way, we could all be speaking Dutch right now in the New York area. We will have links in our show notes to Dr. O'Keefe's work. You can follow up on his research into loyalists in the Hudson Valley. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. And a bit of a spoiler, I'm lining up another Loyalist episode myself. We'll be talking about the Loyalist experience from their side of the issue. If you have your own story to tell about Long Island history, research you've done, or a family connection, or an odd artifact, Nassau, Suffolk, even Brooklyn and Queens pre-consolidation when we were all one big happy island, drop us a line, longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. We'd love to talk to you. But that'll do it for this episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.